Ecclesiastes comes from the Greek word meaning ecclesia. It's the church that's gathered together. You are the ecclesia. Our text for today recognizes that God has a role in bringing people and purposes, money and opportunities together amidst the chaos of human life to do something miraculous and joyful. God did just that here in the Gallatin Valley with the Methodists in the 1860s. But do we remember the story of our birth? Do we think that it was chance that all these people came together in exactly this order for something to be built here in the Gallatin Valley? Do we know our histories? But the challenge is we can't know our histories from inside these walls. So let's go tour Bozeman and the impact we have had on this community and what we need to learn from our own story. In 1865, W. Alderson left the West Ohio Valley and made his way west to Montana. He traveled through the plains. He remarked when he got to the Yellowstone River how gorgeous the short grass was that he saw. But nothing he experienced prepared him for the beauty of what we know as the Gallatin Valley. On June the 5th, 1865, he held the very first service in this valley of Methodists or any religious people, and he said in his journal, "Few attended." 2 weeks later, he held another service, and there were 30 faithful gathered on that afternoon to worship God. Listed on the rolls of the first supporters are names that we will recognize as the street signs here in Bozeman. Of course, there was Reverend Alderson, followed by Mr. Rouse, Mr. Mendenhall, Mr. Tracy, Nelson Story, Mr. Wilson, and of course, John Bozeman. The first church in Bozeman was called the Little Frame Church. It was the corner here of Main and Tracy. It was constructed in 1866. The floor was covered in sawdust. The pews were actually just wooden benches. But it was the first house of worship here in Bozeman, and the Methodists shared it freely with the Presbyterians as partners in ministry. The Catholics, unfortunately, were not allowed to use the building. On April the 13th, 1866, a meeting was held by the church leaders, and an argument ensued over the politics of who was welcomed in the church and who was not. Following the end of the Civil War, there were questions about would Southerners be welcomed in this church here in Bozeman. This was not a Southern Methodist church, and it did not support slavery. And those who did support such a horrible act, they felt could not be included in their church. Thus, a year after its founding, the church split over a political and theological disagreement. What's changed so much in 155 years? We're still arguing about who is in and who is out. We're still leaving the church because unity cannot be held in our disagreements. The second building was constructed on this site in 1874. Its new pastor was the Reverend Curtis, another street name here in Bozeman. But the new building was not without criticism. Some of the old members said that it was too far outside of the city limits, as there was no sidewalks for them to journey to get there. The bell that hangs in the church was cast in 1846 in Ohio, and it was meant to go on a steamboat that would float passengers up and down the Mississippi River. And once that boat's life had ended, the bell was huge and large and could be used for another purpose. And so it was floated up the Missouri to Helena, where it was placed on a carriage and brought to Bozeman. It was so big and there was no tower for it in the original building, they just built a box and it rang back and forth to call the whole town to worship on Sunday morning. In 1874, the bell was really important when it was here. The Reverend Iliff had left on a Saturday night to go officiate a wedding outside of town, and he got lost in a blizzard on the way back. The church members showed up for worship, and Reverend Ilov was nowhere to be found, and so they rang the bell as a way for him to find his way in the dark until he made it to church and could conduct the Sunday service. They said he was fine, although a little chilly. From 1874 to 1906 was a hard year for the church, the Methodist Church here in Bozeman. It faced financial struggles. It barely got a building built. It had trouble constructing it as well as paying for it. It had challenges of clergy during that time span of almost 30 years. Every 2 years, another clergy person was appointed to the church. In 1896, Nelson Story offered the church the land next door at a cheaper rate, and the church passed, deciding instead to revarnish the woodwork and paint the trim. And so the Baptists moved into Bozeman and purchased that land from Nelson Story. 1911 was a crucial year for Bozeman, for the Methodists there, because they made decisions that are part of our core values today. In 1911, the church sent its first missionary from Bozeman into the world. Her name was Grace Clark, and she left to go to Africa, not returning until 1947, but setting in motion our relationship with ministries and missions around the world. On December the 4th, 1911, the board of the Bozeman Methodist Church conducted a drive to support the deaconesses purchasing a building that would become the Bozeman Deaconess Hospital, and began our long relationship with what is now the Bozeman Health System. In 1939, the church established the Wesley Foundation here at Montana State University, and they purchased a house down here on 8th Street where students lived in community. In 1969, the Methodist Global Church helped to build this building where they lived in community even further. It was sold in 1979 to a consortium of partners, the Episcopals, the Presbyterians, and the Lutherans, called the Christus Collegium. In 1948, having survived the Great Depression and the war years, the church received a new young pastor, and he did something scandalous. He knelt down when he prayed, but he was received with friendliness and sincerity. In 1962, the parsonage was built specifically to be a house for the clergy family. It has been known across the region as a home for colleagues to spend the night, share in ministry struggles, and celebrate this unique calling that the clergy are called to. In 1966, the Bozeman Church recognized that there was a need for a facility for the aged, and so they partnered with the Bozeman Deaconess Hospital to design and contribute and build what is now Hillcrest. In 1972, the Boy Scout Troops number 676 was chartered here at Bozeman Methodist Church, and it is going strong in its 47th year. In 1974, Faith UMC and First UMC merged to form Bozeman United Methodist Church, recognizing that the decline of religiosity in the world was a significant issue and how these two communities could be stronger together. The faith leaders of that day recognized how powerful a merger would be for their ministry. In 1985, the church purchased the annex as an office space during the construction of its next building, as well as later a rental property and a use for various ministry needs. Many of you know this history, and you can see the illustrations to our current challenges, whether they're financial, political, theological, or practical. There were times in the last 155 years that this church struggled to pay bills. There were times when the politics created chaos and confusion. There were times there was theological disagreement about who was in and who was out. There were times when practical decisions were not visionary or faithful. And yet through all those challenges, God brought people together here and did miraculous things. In the history of this church, it's interesting to note that not a single person has entered pastoral ordained ministry. And yet in its first 100 years, 12 missionaries were sent from this church to the world to share the good news of God's love. In the very midst of a life that seems out of control, we need to be reminded that God's light has shone on the people of this valley called Methodists, and that we did something with that light. We need to be reminded. Struggles do not make us unique. Rather, it is our ability to overcome them that makes us faithful people of God. When Alderson entered this valley, when he planted a church here 155 years ago, he saw a harsh life for the people who were living in this valley. And he knew they needed a beacon of hope, a symbol to hold them together. This is that symbol. 155 years later, this is that community. You are the people of God called Methodists. And you remain those living here, reminding them there is hope still. Amen. I invite you to stand as you are able for our blessing this day. Next week, we're going to talk about canoeing the mountains, which might sound crazy, but what do Lewis and Clark have to teach us about our challenges we are facing as God's people today, similar to the challenges they faced when they found themselves in Montana? May you go into the world knowing that there is a rich, faithful history here. May you go into the world knowing that you are part of creating the history for tomorrow. Go and remind the people of this valley there is hope.